Off to you.
Hi. Following up on the points that have been raised so far, obviously, as has already been mentioned, the killing of Jamal Khashoggi was both an outrage, of course, but also an indication of the kind of person that we're dealing with here in terms of Mohammed bin Salman. But before we get to talking about justice and what that might look like and how to pursue it and what's being done in the case of Jamal Khashoggi, which is what I'll address, I think it's also worth noting, even with this, given that he's the current ruler, effectively, of Saudi Arabia, that it is still worth understanding and acknowledging that in terms of arbitrary detention, the imprisonment of dissidents and human rights defenders and others in Saudi Arabia, this has a long history, and MBS didn't invent this. Some of the new sentences that have been handed down, which I think my colleague might address, are certainly headline grabbing and shocking in a lot of ways. But there, even as some of the cases that have been mentioned before of human rights defenders and activists who've been imprisoned, many of those happened prior to MBS coming to power. And so that this is a feature of Saudi Arabia and the ruling family, effectively, as to how they have dealt with and addressed concerns and by their own population, how they've dealt with their own population over time. And so we can understand the killing of Jamal Khashoggi in that context, as well as we could also understand it as the action by, effectively, I'm not a professional analyst here, but the way in which Jamal Khashoggi was killed certainly would suggest that the person behind who imagined such an outcome is perhaps a psychopath or a sociopath. And so when making comparisons to other authoritarian rulers in the region, as Dr. Nasir pointed out about Saddam, I'm actually more often thinking of another analogy, which is that of the former Libyan authoritarian ruler, Muammar Gaddafi. And I think maybe MBS kind of straddles a little bit of both examples in a lot of ways, both in terms of his own megalomania, but also in terms of how the West has dealt with those prior to rulers. In terms of pursuing justice for Jamal, and in this case, I'll speak to what's ongoing and what potentially is still out there. There is a civil case in the United States brought by my organization and Dr. Abdullah's organization, Dawn, along with the fiancée of Jamal, Hatija, in a United States civil court, so not a criminal court, a civil court, making a civil case. And we have identified MBS as the culprit, as the perpetrator. And where that is right now, and what is now becoming a very interesting moment, is that the court has referred to the US State Department to question whether or not this case can proceed from the State Department's position as to whether or not MBS is the head of state. There is a head of state immunity in US law, which would prevent, effectively, this case from going forward. And when the judge in the case brought that question to the State Department, this was prior to President Biden's trip last summer, in the summertime, to the region. And so the State Department asked for a delay, largely because it didn't want to impede on the diplomatic trip that President Biden was making to the region. Since then, two things have happened, which maybe change what the considerations are of the United States. One is, of course, as has been mentioned, the manipulation of the oil production such that it is a counter to US interests and certainly to President Biden's interests in the context of domestic US elections, et cetera. But also, MBS was named as prime minister in a royal decree, seemingly in violation of Saudi law, which specifies who is the prime minister, and it does leave a little bit of question as to whether or not the king has the authority to appoint the crown prince or anybody else as prime minister. But the king, as long as the king is alive, and this king still is meant to be the prime minister according to Saudi law. Yet MBS has been named the prime minister, seemingly in an attempt to head off this civil lawsuit. So we shouldn't dismiss the civil lawsuit just because it's civil and not criminal, and we shouldn't dismiss it. Obviously, it's a concern to the Saudi ruler and the de facto ruler, and now the State Department has to weigh in on this. What seemingly at the time, perhaps was going to be the expected outcome, which was the State Department granting him recognition as head of state, now seems to be in doubt and question, especially now that we have senators and congresspeople in the United States, as well as people in the administration itself, fundamentally questioning the entire US-Saudi relationship at this point. And there have been some really unprecedented statements made by some key senior senators, especially about effectively terminating the status quo of the U.S.-Saudi relationship and redoing it, seemingly according to some of the ideas that Professor Davis mentioned about setting up a new U.S. foreign policy. Not that grand yet, but certainly along those lines. The second way that Dawn has tried to go after accountability in this case is with a criminal case, a criminal complaint. And this is in France this summer, just after the Biden trip to the region. MBS headed to France for meetings with the French president. And because he was on French soil, that opened the door for the filing of a criminal complaint against MBS, according to the French law, which includes universal jurisdiction. And so the crime of enforced disappearance, of torture, and effectively of murder, those crimes can be brought into the French legal system according to France's legal code of the fact that it has universal jurisdiction for such crimes. And given that MBS was on French soil, that enabled us to not only file the case, but that for French investigators to actually take up and pursue. That's in progress at this point. It didn't matter that MBS subsequently left the territory. That has been filed, it is valid, and the French legal system has to deal with it. Of course, we know that the French political side of things has extraordinary interest in Saudi Arabia. It is one of the Saudi's largest arms suppliers at this point, and French companies, much as American companies, are rushing to do business with MBS. So there is considerable political and economic reasons to think that this case could potentially be dropped, but France also has a reputation, and the reputation is proud of in terms of its own legal system, and the fact that it offers universal jurisdiction, that it was a leader on the UN Convention against enforced disappearance, and is very proud of its stance in that regard. So it is still a question as to what's going to happen with that. That said, there are other countries that also offer universal jurisdiction, and in some ways, one of the most important things that we accomplished by filing the lawsuit in France was to signal to MBS that he doesn't get a free pass when he wants to travel around the world. Everywhere he goes, he can expect that there's going to be the filing of a case in places where there is universal jurisdiction against him for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And this is one way we're going to keep up the fight for justice in his case. Looking at a little bit broader picture, this question of impunity in the killing of journalists and the killing of human rights defenders, and in this case, we have Jamal Khashoggi, who also had a connection to the United States as he was a resident here in the US, begs a question to the United States in terms of impunity and these issues. And in this region, we also have another notorious case now of another journalist, Shireen Abu Akleh, who is a Palestinian-American journalist who was killed by Israeli forces. In both cases, we are seeing the United States take a position despite having overwhelming evidence pointing to who the perpetrators are and that there could be accountability. We see the United States government deflecting, or in some case, in the case of Shireen, actively working to defend the Israeli government. This is not a sustainable policy as part of, the U.S. approach to the region or to the world. And of course, we see a flat-out hypocrisy when it comes to the case of Ukraine, where quite the opposite. We see all sorts of support by the United States government for the Ukrainian government to pursue war crimes cases, even the United States government talking about using the International Criminal Court, which is itself a bit of whiplash, given that the US refuses to sign on to the Rome Statute and to join the International Criminal Court. So this is increasingly, as there's more and more awareness, as there's more and more organization by civil society, by human rights activists, and including by journalists, to push on accountability issues, that the United States is, in particular, but this I think goes for other Western countries too, are walking a path of double standards, of hypocrisy, etc., that isn't satisfying, causes of justice, but also isn't satisfying American national security or foreign policy interests anymore. And whereas in previous days, in decades ago, where the United States could support authoritarian, and Western countries could support authoritarian rulers despite what they do to their own populations, that policy, I think, is the days for that policy to survive, that kind of approach to foreign policy, as Professor Davis has mentioned, are coming to an end. And we as civil society, we as empowered and connected members of a global civil society need to keep up our pressure and need to keep up our work in order to give voice to the voiceless in a lot of ways, but also hold our governments greater to account for this kind of duplicity that they have, in some ways being accomplices to these gruesome murders and to the policies that are imprisoning dissidents, human rights defenders, journalists in these kinds of countries. With that, I will conclude and turn it to my colleague.